The cold was not of winter, but of polished stone. It rose from the floor of the chamber of echoes, seeping through the thin soles of his shoes, a constant, grounding ache. The air carried the smell of old wax from the sconces, of dust disturbed by shuffling feet, and beneath it all, the faint, metallic tang of the river that flowed deep beneath the citadel. He stood at his assigned place, a stone lectern worn smooth by generations of hands that had gripped its edges while speaking into the silence. He was the voice of the Eastern Quarter. For 20 years he had held the title. It was carved into the lectern before him, a shallow groove filled with the grime of decades. He was allowed to speak. This was the first and fundamental fact of his existence within the great mechanism. Every seventh day, as the pale light of dawn filtered through the high, narrow windows and painted the chamber in stripes of grey and gold, the Council of Nine would take their seats on the raised dais. They wore robes of deep crimson, the color of old wine or dried blood. He wore grey, the color of the stone, of the dust, of the parchment he would read from. The ritual never varied. The senior counselor, a man with a voice like gravel being poured, would nod. That was the signal. The voice would step forward, clear his throat of the night's silence, and begin. He would report on the state of the granaries in the Eastern Quarter. He would detail the repairs needed for the old aqueduct. He would list the names of those who had died in the past week and the names of children newly born. He would speak of a dispute between two millers over water rights, of the price of lamp oil, of the strange sickness affecting the cherry trees in the orchards. His voice was clear, measured, and precise. He had trained it to be so. It would fill the chamber, bounce off the vaulted ceiling, and settle around the 9 seated figures. They would listen. Their faces were masks of polite attention. Sometimes a counselor would make a note on a slate. Sometimes one might lean over and whisper to a neighbor. When he finished, there would be a moment of silence, thick and heavy as wool. Then the senior counselor would nod again. "Thank you, voice of the Eastern Quarter," he would say. "Your report is noted," and that was all. The session would move to the next voice from the Northern Quarter, then the Western, then the Southern. 4 voices, 4 reports, 4 polite acknowledgments. The injustice was not in a locked door or a loaf of sawdust bread. It was far more elegant and far more cruel. The injustice was in the perfect, seamless functioning of the ritual itself. He was not cast out. He was brought in, given a place of honor, a title, a duty. He was given the illusion of mattering. His words entered the official record. Scribes in the gallery would scratch his every syllable onto parchment scrolls that would be stored in the archives. A mountain of spoken words preserved for eternity. But the decision, the act, the movement of resources, the application of justice, these things happened elsewhere, in smaller rooms behind heavy doors, in conversations held after the formal session over cups of spiced wine, in the silent calculus of power and patronage that he could observe but never influence. His speaking was the release valve. It was the theater of care. By hearing him, the system demonstrated its benevolence. By doing nothing with what it heard, it preserved its absolute control. The cost was personal, and it was paid daily. It was the ache in his lower back from standing perfectly still for hours. It was the dryness in his throat after speaking 10,000 words into a void that absorbed them all. It was the slow erosion of hope, grain by grain, like sandstone worn by the wind. He would return to his small apartment in the Eastern Quarter, the smell of baking bread and open sewers replacing the citadel's dust and wax. People would nod to him respectfully. "There goes the voice," they would murmur. "He hears us." And he would feel the weight of that trust, a trust placed in a conduit that led nowhere. The cruelty of the system was not active malice. It was passive efficiency. It granted him identity, but stripped him of agency. It made him essential to the performance of governance and utterly irrelevant to its practice. This was the hook, not in the flesh, but in the spirit. The cold stone, the listening silence, the thank you that was a period, not a comma. This was the world in which he lived, and the first quiet, devastating analysis of its nature was this: the understanding that the greatest prisons often have no bars, only very well-defined and honored roles within them. After the chamber's silence came the quarter's noise. The voice walked home through streets that smelled of yesterday's rain on cobblestones, of fish from the market stalls being packed in salt, of the sweet decay from the midden heaps behind the tenements. Children chased a wooden hoop, their laughter sharp and bright against the general murmur. A woman called from an upper window, her voice frayed with worry. He knew her. Her son had fallen from a roof mending tiles. He had reported the accident in last week's session. The boy's name was among the injuries, noted, the senior counselor had said. The boy still needed a surgeon the family could not afford. The voice touched the brim of his grey cap as he passed beneath her window, a small, useless gesture. His apartment was on the third floor of a building that leaned slightly against its neighbor. The stairs groaned underfoot, each step releasing the scent of old wood and the faint, musty odor of the river when it flooded in spring. The door to his rooms was plain oak, darkened by time. Inside, the space was neat, sparse, a reflection of a life lived in careful measure. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small hearth, cold now, and against the far wall his true work, not the lectern but the desk. It was smaller, of lighter wood, scarred by ink and the pressure of his hands. Here he was not the voice. Here he was the archivist of his own silence. On the desk lay his tools, a knife for sharpening quills, its blade worn thin. A pot of ink he mixed himself from oak gall and iron salts, a process that left his fingertips stained a bluish black for days. A stack of blank paper, rough to the touch, made from the rags collected in the quarter. And the ledgers, they were not official records, they were his. In them he did not report, he connected. He tracked the price of grain not just season to season, but against the repairs to the granary roof he had reported 3 years prior. He mapped the outbreaks of fever against the years the aqueduct maintenance had been deferred. He noted which miller won the water dispute, and which councillor's nephew suddenly acquired a new cart. This was his survival, not in the wild but within the machine. His competence was not in speaking. It was in listening, in remembering, in seeing the patterns in the noise that the council chose to hear as separate, disconnected facts. His fingers, stained and sometimes cracked from the cold, moved over the pages with a certainty they never had on the stone lectern. Here he decided what mattered. Here he controlled the narrative. The sound in this room was the scratch of nib on paper, the soft rustle of a page turning, the occasional sigh as he sat back, his eyes tracing the lines of cause and effect he had drawn. This was the quiet virtue. It required no audience. It granted no title. It was the meticulous construction of understanding from the raw material of neglect. It was how he endured the weekly performance, the thank you that closed like a door. He had something they did not see, something they could not take because they did not know it existed. A map of the machine's true workings, drawn in quiet hours, by the light of a single tallow candle whose smoke left a faint, greasy scent in the air. A scent that clung to his clothes and his hair, the smell of private, patient work. The festival of the 4 voices happened once a year, at the height of summer. It was the system's celebration of itself, a grand performance where the symbolic inclusion was displayed for all to see. The air in the great plaza was thick with the smell of roasting meats from a dozen spits, of sweet pastries frying in hot oil, of the sweat of the crowd pressed together under the sun. Banners in the four-quarter colors, gray for the east, blue for the north, green for the west, and brown for the south, hung from every balcony. Music played, pipes and drums, a lively rhythm that made the cobblestones seem to vibrate. At the center of the plaza stood a temporary platform, draped in crimson cloth. The Council of Nine sat there in their full regalia, smiling benignly at the people they governed, and one by one the four voices were called forward. The voice of the Eastern Quarter stood in his place, feeling the rough texture of his formal gray robe, a heavier version of his daily wear. He watched as the voice of the Northern Quarter was summoned first. That man spoke of the harbor's bounty of full nets and safe voyages. The crowd cheered. The council nodded. A ceremonial pouch of silver coins was presented to him, a public reward for his service. The same ritual repeated for the Western voice, who spoke of fertile fields, and the Southern voice, who spoke of orderly markets. Then it was his turn. He climbed the steps to the platform, the wood creaking under his weight. He looked out at the sea of faces, people from his own quarter, people who had trusted him with their worries. He cleared his throat, the familiar dryness there despite the humid air. He spoke. He did not speak of granaries or aqueducts. That was for the Chamber of Echoes. Today he spoke of resilience. He spoke of the community that endured, that supported one another when official channels were slow. He spoke in broad, hopeful strokes, as was expected. The words felt like ash in his mouth. The crowd listened, their faces upturned, hopeful. When he finished, there was applause. It washed over him, a warm, roaring sound. The senior counselor rose, placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of paternal approval felt by the entire plaza. Another pouch of silver was pressed into his hand. The weight was insignificant, the gesture was everything. Here is your reward for speaking, it said. Here is your place in the spectacle, be satisfied. This was the societal layer of the trap. It was not enough for the system to function in the quiet chamber. It had to be loved in the noisy square. By making the voice a public figure, by celebrating his role, the system transformed potential grievance into civic pride. The people saw their representative honored, they felt heard. The fact that the honor was purely symbolic, that the silver was a pittance compared to the resources that never flowed eastward, was obscured by the music. The food, the collective joy. The man with the broken son saw the voice on the platform, receiving recognition, and his resentment toward the distant council might soften. Redirected toward gratitude for the man who tried. This was the genius of false inclusion at the societal level. It co-opts the natural human desire for recognition and belonging. It turns the representative into a lightning rod, absorbing the frustration that should rightly be aimed at the power structure itself. The voice walked back through the cheering crowd, the pouch of silver, a cold, hard lump in his hand. He smelled the fried dough, heard the laughter of children who had forgotten their daily hardships for an afternoon. He felt the approving pats on his back. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that his true prison was not the Chamber of Echoes. It was this plaza. It was the love of the people, meticulously engineered to keep him and them exactly where they were. The system's control was not maintained by force alone, but by this careful, annual theater of gratitude. It connected his personal duty to a societal performance so convincing that to reject it would feel like a betrayal, not of the council, but of the very people he was meant to serve. To understand the prison, one must examine its architecture. The system that granted voice but withheld control was not an accident of personality or a temporary arrangement. It was a meticulously engineered construct, a machine of governance with specific, interlocking parts designed for one primary function. The preservation of power, let us dissect it. First, the stage, the Chamber of Echoes itself. Its physical design was not neutral. The high ceiling captured sound, yes, but it also diminished the speaker. The man at the lectern looked up at the council on their dais. The spatial hierarchy was unambiguous. The narrow windows admitted light but no broad view, focusing attention inward on the ritual. Second, the ritual, the fixed order of speakers, the unvarying signal, the nod. The prescribed format of the report, facts without interpretation, problems without proposed solutions. This ritualization served to depersonalize the content. It became a procedural input, not a human appeal. Third, the record, the scribes in the gallery, their scratching pens transformed living speech into dead parchment. The archive was the system's memory, but it was a selective, formalized memory. It recorded what was said, not what was meant, nor what was felt in the silence afterward. The archive created the illusion of permanence and attention, while actually functioning as a tomb for words. Fourth, the feedback mechanism, or rather, the deliberate lack thereof, the thank you that ended all discussion. The absence of questions, of debate, of follow-up, this was the critical component. By providing no channel for the voice to influence action, the system severed the fundamental link between communication and consequence. The speaker was transformed from an agent into a censor, a mere reporting device. Fifth, the reward structure, the festival, the silver pouch, the public recognition. These were not rewards for effectiveness, but for participation. They incentivized continued performance within the role, not challenges to the role's limitations. They made the cage comfortable, even honorable. Sixth and most subtle, the system of plausible deniability it created. When the aqueduct failed, the council could point to the records. The voice reported the cracks 3 years ago, they could say, it was noted, the implication being that the reporting itself was the required action. The system's failure was reframed as the completion of its process. The cruelty was systemic, baked into the design. It was a cruelty of cold efficiency, not hot malice. It did not require evil men, only obedient ones. The counselors were not ogres, they were administrators. They believed in the system, in its order, its cleanliness. They likely slept well at night, believing they had listened. This is why the injustice was so hard to fight. There was no single villain to blame, no locked door to batter down. There was only the smooth, polished functioning of the machine, a machine that had carefully extracted the moral agency from everyone involved. From the speakers to the listeners. The voice's struggle, therefore, could not be against persons, it had to be against processes. It had to be an attempt to reintroduce friction into a system designed for seamless, endless, and ultimately empty conversation. His private ledgers were the beginning of that friction. They were a shadow system, one that reconnected the dots the official process kept carefully separate. They were the first quiet analysis of the machine's blueprint, drawn not in the citadel's ink, but in the stain of oak gall and iron. In the privacy of a room that smelled of tallow smoke and patience. The winter that year was a long, grey hand closing around the city. The cold in the Chamber of Echoes was no longer just stone deep, it was in the air itself. A sharpness that made the breath of the scribes visible as they wrote. The voice stood at his lectern, his report a litany of chill. The price of charcoal had tripled. 3 elderly tenants in the unheated tenements on Mud Lane had been found stiff in their beds. The old aqueduct, its cracks now a network of frozen fissures, had finally ceased to flow to the eastern public well. He spoke the facts, his voice steady, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a frozen pond. The council listened, their faces pale in the weak light. The senior counselor nodded. "Thank you, voice of the Eastern Quarter. Your report is noted." The session moved on. That afternoon the voice did not go straight home. He walked instead to Mud Lane. The air there smelled of soot from meager fires and the deeper, colder smell of poverty, of unwashed wool and despair. He found the building, its door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the stairwell was dark. He climbed to the third floor, to the room where one of the old men had lived. The door was ajar. The room was bare, just a pallet of straw on the floor, a single thin blanket. The cold here was absolute, having settled into the very plaster of the walls. He stood in the center of the room, his own breath pluming. This was the detail. This was the texture of the facts he reported. The cold iron of the door latch under his fingers, the rough, damp feel of the plaster. The utter silence, broken only by the distant sound of a child coughing in another room. This was his skill, not just recording but witnessing. He did not look away. He let the reality of the place imprint itself upon him, the sensory truth that the polished words in the chamber could never convey. He returned to his apartment as the early dusk fell. His fingers were numb. He lit his tallow candle, the flame struggling against the gloom. The smell of the smoke was a welcome familiarity. He sat at his desk but did not open his ledgers. Instead, he took a fresh sheet of paper, its surface rough and thirsty. He selected his finest quill, one he reserved for special entries. And he began to draw, not words, not numbers, a map. He started with Mud Lane, a single line. He marked the building, a small square. From it he drew lines, one line to the public well, now dry. He wrote the word aqueduct beside it, another line to the charcoal merchants' district across the river. He wrote the price, 3 times the usual. Another line to the citadel, a long, straight vector. He did not write words on that line, he left it blank. He worked by the flickering light, his stained fingers moving with a calm precision. The map grew. It connected the death from cold to the failure of infrastructure, to the economics of scarcity, to the center of power where decisions were not made. It was a picture of causality. It was his trade, the weaver not of cloth, but of understanding. The bleeding fingers were the cracked skin from the cold, the ink stains, the ache of holding the quill for hours. The broth was the warmth of the single candle, the focus that kept the larger chill at bay. This was how he survived. Not by changing the system yet, but by comprehending it so completely that its failures were no longer disconnected misfortunes. They were a pattern, and a pattern can be studied, predicted, and ultimately, perhaps, disrupted. He finished the map as the candle guttered, leaving the room in near darkness save for the glow of the coals in the hearth. He looked at the web of lines on the paper. It was a record of a crime, but the crime was one of omission, of neglect engineered into policy. It was the quiet virtue of the powerless, to see clearly what the powerful have chosen to ignore. He rolled the map carefully, tied it with a cord, and placed it in a hollow space behind a loose brick in the wall near his desk, an archive of one. A testament written not for the citadel's records, but for his own soul, and for a future moment he could not yet see. The system was not new. The voice understood this as he worked in the archives one afternoon, a rare privilege granted for reviewing past reports. The air here was different, thick with the smell of aged paper, leather bindings, and the peculiar, dry scent of preserved time. Dust motes danced in shafts of light from high windows. He pulled a scroll from a shelf marked with the seal of a century past. The parchment crackled as he unrolled it. The handwriting was different, more ornate, but the structure was identical. A report from the Voice of the Eastern Quarter, dated 103 years prior. It spoke of a fever in the lower wards. It detailed the overcrowding in the tenements. It noted the lack of clean water. The language was formal, precise, detached. At the bottom, a different hand had written a single notation: noted by the council. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He pulled another scroll 50 years later, a report on the failing foundations of the granary, noted by the council, another 30 years after that. A report on the extortionate prices charged by the river bargemen for transporting grain, noted by the council. He sat back on the wooden stool, the hard seat pressing against him. His fingers, still stained from his own ink, rested on the cold parchment. This was the historical layer. The pattern was not a flaw in the current administration. It was the design of the institution itself, stretching back generations. The system of false inclusion was a historical technology as durable as the stone of the citadel. It had survived wars, changes of dynasty, plagues. It had adapted by perfecting its rituals, by making the theater more convincing, but its core function remained unchanged: to hear without listening, to record without acting, to include without empowering. The voices across time were not individuals. They were replaceable components in a long, running machine. Their names changed. Their personal sufferings were unique, but their function was constant. They were the pressure valve, the sounding board, the living proof that the system was responsive, even as it remained perfectly static in its distribution of actual power. The historical cost was immense, but it was a cost borne invisibly in the aggregate. It was the sum total of all the unrepaired aqueducts, all the unheeded fevers, all the frozen elderly. All the trust slowly eroded over generations until it became a cultural habit, a quiet despair woven into the fabric of life in the Eastern Quarter. People learned not to expect more. They learned that having a voice was the limit of their political imagination. This was the system's deepest victory. It didn't just manage discontent in the present. It shaped the expectations of the future. It made its own continuity seem natural, inevitable. The rebellion it prevented was not the rebellion of swords. It was the rebellion of expectation, the simple, dangerous thought that things could be otherwise. By providing a channel for complaint that led nowhere, it drained that revolutionary potential away over decades, centuries, into the vast, silent archive where words went to die. The voice rolled the ancient scrolls back up, their dry sound like a whisper. He returned them to their shelf. His own report from last week would eventually find its way here, another scroll in the endless column, noted by the council. The connection was now complete in his mind. His personal struggle was not his alone. It was the latest iteration of a struggle that spanned the life of the city itself. He was not fighting a council of 9 men. He was fighting history. He was fighting the weight of precedent, the inertia of a solution that had worked, for those in power, for a very, very long time. The helper in this tale was not a person in the present, but the ghosts in the archive. The forgotten voices whose identical frustrations proved this was not a personal failure, but a systemic one. Their silent testimony in dust and ink was the overlooked ally, showing him the true scale and age of the enemy. Why does it work? Why does a person, granted the dignity of a title and a platform, not simply rebel? The answer lies not in the system's strength, but in a fundamental vulnerability of the human mind it exploits. The psychological mechanism is precise and devastating. First, the system offers identity. You are not a nobody, you are the voice. This title becomes woven into the self. To attack the system is to attack a part of who you are. It creates a cognitive dissonance so painful that most will seek to resolve it by doubling down on their role, by speaking more earnestly, by believing more deeply in the process. Second, it provides a simulacrum of efficacy. The act of speaking feels like doing something. The brain registers the effort, the preparation, the performance as action. This neural reward, the feeling of having discharged a duty, can be enough to satisfy the drive for agency, especially when no real avenue for agency exists. It is a placebo for power. Third, and most crucially, it manipulates hope. The structure is always just open enough to sustain the belief that next time, if the report is clearer, if the facts are more compelling, if the right counselor is listening, then the words will translate into action. This hope is the hook that keeps the subject compliant. It turns frustration into a puzzle to be solved within the rules, rather than a reason to break the rules. The system's thank you is not a period. It is an ellipsis. It implies a future where things might be different. This perpetual tomorrow is a powerful anesthetic. The voice experienced this directly. After each session, walking back to his quarter, he would dissect his own performance. Was my tone respectful enough? Were the data points in the optimal order? Perhaps I should include more comparative figures from last year. This internal critique was the system working on his psyche. It turned his energy inward, toward perfecting his function within the machine, rather than outward, toward challenging the machine's purpose. The cost at this systemic, psychological layer is the slow erosion of the will to genuine self-determination. The subject begins to conflate participation with influence. They start to believe the stage is the world. Their map of possibility shrinks to the boundaries of the role they have been given. The coldness here is not in the stone, but in the wiring of the mind. The system is cold to the villain because there is no villain, only a set of conditioning parameters. It is empathetic to the victim only in the sense that it understands the victim's needs for recognition and purpose, and provides counterfeit versions of both. This is why fairy tales of this type are survival manuals. They are not about building strength to break down the door. They are about recognizing the door is an illusion, that you are already inside a much larger room, and that your assigned seat is part of the furniture designed to make you stay in it. The first step to defeating such a system is not action, but a specific kind of perception. It is the perception that the satisfaction you feel after performing your duty is a chemical trick, that the hope you nurture is a carefully managed resource, and that your identity as the voice is a costume you can choose to stop wearing, at least in the privacy of your own mind. The voice's ledgers, his maps, were the beginning of this perceptual shift. They were a way of creating a new identity, that of the analyst, the cartographer of silence. This new identity operated outside the psychological rewards of the old one. Its satisfaction came from understanding, not from performance. Its hope was not for a change within the system, but for a moment when understanding could be weaponized against the system's own logic. This is the quiet, psychological virtue. It is the internal rewiring that must happen before any external change is possible. The helper came not from the woods, but from the lowest level of the citadel itself. His name was Elric, and he was a keeper of the undercroft, the labyrinth of storerooms, cisterns, and forgotten passages that ran beneath the chamber of echoes. The voice met him by chance, or by a logic deeper than chance. It was late, long after the official sessions had ended. The voice had stayed to review a point of procedure in the archive, a question about the scheduling of infrastructure reports. As he left, a side door, usually locked, stood slightly ajar. A draught of cold, damp air flowed from it, carrying the smell of wet stone and old mortar. Driven by a curiosity that had become his habit, he pushed the door open and descended a narrow spiral staircase. The sound here was the drip of water somewhere in the darkness, and the scuttle of tiny claws on stone. At the bottom, in a small chamber lit by a single rush lamp, sat Elric. He was an old man, his back bent from a lifetime in low spaces. His hands were rough, his nails rimed with dirt. He was mending a leather bucket. He looked up, not with surprise, but with a weary recognition. "You are the Eastern voice," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I hear you every week. The The sound comes down through the grates. The voice stood frozen. The idea that his words filtered down here to this forgotten man was unsettling. "I am sorry," the voice said, though for what, he was not sure. For the noise. Elric gave a short, barking laugh that echoed in the vault. "No, for the waste. I hear the facts, I hear the silence after. I have worked down here for 40 years. I know which stones sweat when the aqueduct leaks above. I know which storerooms hold the timber meant for repairs that never happen. I am the one who counts the empty sacks when the grain shipment is short." The voice stepped closer. The lamplight gleamed on the old man's eyes. "What do you do with that knowledge?" "Nothing. I keep it, like you keep your ledgers." The voice felt a jolt. "How do you know about my ledgers?" Elric shrugged, a movement like shifting stones. "The quarter is small. People talk. The woman whose son fell, she says you listened. The charcoal seller you questioned about his prices, he remembers. You are building something they cannot see. I am building something they walk over." He gestured to the walls around them. "I have maps too. Not of streets, but of pipes, of foundations, of the true supports of this place, and where they are weak." He was the overlooked ally, not a woodcutter with an axe, but a keeper of foundations with a lamp and a memory. His kindness was not sentimental. It was the solidarity of those who see the truth of a structure because they live in its shadows. He aided the voice because he recognized a fellow cartographer of neglect. In the following weeks, a quiet exchange began. The voice would bring down scraps of information, a counselor's off-hand remark about budgets, a date for inspection. Elric would provide the physical counterpart, the measurement of a crack that had widened, the inventory of materials that had been diverted. The helper's role was to connect the abstract system to its physical decay. He provided the smell of rot behind the polished walls, the sound of dripping water that foretold collapse, the touch of crumbling mortar. This alliance was the first integration of the voice's abstract understanding with the tangible reality of the system's failure. It was no longer just about data in ledgers. It was about the weight of a stone, the flow of water, the integrity of a beam. The fight, when it came, would not be with words alone, but with the physical consequences of those words being ignored for a century. Elric was the proof that the system's blindness created its own opposition in the dark places it never thought to look. The crisis arrived not with a shout but with a smell. It was early spring, the time of thaw. The voice walked through the eastern quarter and caught a new scent on the air, cutting through the usual smells of mud and waking earth. It was the smell of stagnation, of water that has stood too long, laced with something fouler, something organic and wrong. It came from the direction of the dry public well. He followed it. A small crowd had gathered, their faces pinched with worry. The well was not dry anymore. A sluggish, brownish liquid seeped up from its depths, filling the stone basin. The smell was overpowering here, a miasma of rot and waste. Elric was there, standing at the back of the crowd, his expression grim. He met the voice's eyes and gave a slight, grave nod. "The aqueduct," he murmured when the voice approached. "Its main channel runs near the old burial grounds upstream, the winter cracks, the spring floods. The seepage. It was not just a failure of water delivery, it was a catastrophic failure of public health, a literal poisoning of the source." This was the moment the system's elegant, endless conversation was forced to confront a physical reality it could not talk away. People could not drink promises, they could not wash with noted reports. The conflict was no longer abstract. The gluttonous villain was not a person, but the system's own insatiable hunger for stability, for the preservation of its rituals at all costs. That hunger now wanted what the protagonist had built, not to possess it, but to neutralize it. The system would want the crisis managed within its existing framework. It would want a report, It would want a committee to study the water. It would want the voice to stand in the chamber of echoes and describe the smell, the color, the fear, so that it could be noted and filed, and forgotten while people grew sick. The villain's return was the demand that the voice continue to play his part, to be the censor, the reporter, the pressure valve, even as the pressure threatened to blow the entire quarter apart. The twist was that the protagonist would not fight this demand. He would fulfill it, but not in the way the system expected. He would use his trade. His trade was not merely speaking, it was the synthesis of information, the construction of a narrative from disparate facts. He had the historical reports of aqueduct cracks. He had Elric's maps of the compromised foundations near the burial grounds. He had his own ledgers tracking the deferred maintenance. He had the physical, olfactory evidence in the air everyone breathed. His fight would be to weaponize his report, to craft it so precisely, so irrefutably, that the system's own rules and its cherished image of benevolent order would force it to take an action it had avoided for a century. The trap was being set, not with poison but with procedure, not with a stifling dress, but with a meticulously documented chain of causality that would leave the council no polite, passive way out. The setup would be the next session in the Chamber of Echoes. The stage was the same cold stone, the ritual was the same nod. But the content would be different. It would not be a list of problems. It would be an indictment written not in the language of rebellion, but in the flawless, dry language of the system's own archives. The crisis was the hook that would snag the villain's own cloak of legitimacy. The quiet work in the small room, the alliance in the undercroft, the historical research in the archive, all of it was preparation for this moment. The system, in its gluttony for control, had taught him its own language. Now he would speak it back to them with a clarity they could not dismiss. He did not go to the citadel the next day. He stayed in his apartment. The smell from the quarter below was a constant, faint presence, a reminder that could not be ignored. He closed his shutters against it, not to hide but to focus. The room was dim, lit only by the grey light filtering through the slats. He sat at his desk. The tools were laid out before him, the knife, the ink, the fresh paper. The ledgers were open, their pages filled with his careful script. The map of Mud Lane was unrolled, a spiderweb of cause and effect. Elric had provided a smaller, cruder sketch on a piece of scrap leather, showing the suspected point of aquifer contamination. The historical scrolls from the archive were present in his memory, their dry notations echoing. This was the quiet preparation. The sound was the soft scrape of the knife as he sharpened his quill to a perfect point. The smell was the familiar, astringent scent of his oak gall ink as he unstoppered the pot. The touch was the rough texture of the paper, waiting. He did not begin to write immediately. He sat in the stillness, his stained fingers resting on the wood. He was not the voice in this moment. He was the architect of a specific kind of truth. His task was not to complain. It was to construct a narrative so airtight, so rooted in the system's own documented reality, that to deny it would be to deny the system's reason for existing. He would use their language, their dates, their official notations. He would connect the report of cracks from 3 years ago, noted by the council, to Elric's measurement of their width last winter. He would cite the historical precedent of fever outbreaks following water failures, documented in the archive. He would reference the civic charter, the clause that charged the council with maintaining public salubrity. He would present the contaminated well not as a new problem, but as the inevitable, predicted, and documented culmination of a century of neglected duty. This was his trade. The weaver's bleeding fingers were the countless hours of transcription, the ink-stained skin. The cook's broth was the simmering synthesis of disparate facts into a single, potent argument. He began to write. His hand moved slowly, deliberately. Each word was chosen not for emotion, but for precision. Each fact was referenced to a source, a date, a ledger entry. He built the case sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. The room grew darker as the afternoon wore on. He lit his tallow candle. The small flame cast a warm, wavering light over the page, the smell of its smoke mingling with the ink. He was building a trap from parchment and precedent. The feast that would poison was this report itself, a dish made entirely from ingredients the council themselves had provided, or had chosen to ignore. To consume it, to accept its logic, would force them into a position where their only choices were to act, or to publicly admit that their entire process was a sham. He wrote until his hand cramped. He wrote until the candle burned low. He did not stop. This was the relief, not from the tension, but into a deeper concentration. It was the grounding of all his abstract analysis into a single, tangible document. It was the personal reclamation of his voice, not as a performative instrument, but as a tool of exacting craft. When he finally set the quill down, the document was complete. Several pages of dense, flawless script, a history of failure, a prophecy fulfilled. A legal and moral indictment written in the cold, clear language of the very system it accused. He sanded the pages, blew the dust away, and stacked them neatly. He felt no triumph, only a profound fatigue and a crystalline clarity. The weapon was forged. Tomorrow he would carry it into the chamber of echoes, and he would speak. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The collapse of systems built on false inclusion follows a recognizable pattern, a rhythm discernible across centuries. Consider the Roman client kings, granted titles and honors by the Senate, invited to speak in the forum, their grievances heard and noted, while real military and fiscal power remained firmly in Roman hands. Their inclusion was a tool of pacification, a theater of respect that drained the will for independent action until it was too late. Consider the medieval parliaments summoned by kings in times of need, the burghers and minor nobles given a voice to approve taxes. Their petitions received with solemnity, yet the royal prerogative to ignore them remained absolute. The voice was a concession, not a share of power. Consider the colonial assemblies in distant lands, allowed to debate local ordinances under the watchful eye of a governor appointed by a distant crown. They could speak of roads, of markets, of minor disputes. They could not speak of sovereignty. In each case, the architecture was similar, a grant of symbolic participation, a ritual of hearing, a meticulous record. A severance of that voice from the levers of substantive change. And in each case, the collapse came not from a sudden revolt of the voiceless, but from the gradual, often reluctant, action of the included. It came when a client king, like Herod, internalized the Roman logic so completely that he used it to manage his own people, becoming an agent of the system until his own territory was merely an administrative unit. It came when the burghers in Parliament, tired of funding wars with no say in their prosecution, slowly leveraged their control over the purse to extract real constitutional concessions, turning the symbol of taxation into a tool of power. It came when the colonial assemblies began to use the very procedures and legal arguments of the mother country to articulate a case for independence. Fighting the empire with its own language of rights and governance, the historical layer reveals that the trap often springs on the trap's setter. The system, in its gluttony for control, educates its subjects in its own methods. It teaches them procedure, record, keeping, the language of legitimacy. It makes them experts in the machine. And then, when a crisis reveals the machine's fatal flaw, those experts are positioned to exploit it. They do not bring a foreign weapon. They use a wrench from the machine's own toolbox to jam its gears. The voice's prepared report was not an innovation. It was a historical tactic. He was acting as the burgher leveraging the power of the purse, as the colonial assembly citing the crown's own laws. He was using the system's obsession with precedent and record to hold up a mirror to its own neglect. The historical integration here is crucial. It shows that his seemingly personal, quiet struggle is part of a long, slow, and often victorious human tradition. The powerless do not win by becoming powerful in the way the powerful understand power. They win by becoming better technicians of the system than the system itself. They win by patience, by documentation, by a deeper literacy in the rules than those who wrote them. The collapse of the Citadel's particular illusion would not be a unique event. It would be the latest verse in an old, recurring song. The helper, Elric, represented the physical decay that history records as the inevitable result of such systems. The archives contained the written proof. The voice was now the synthesizing agent, the one who connected the physical to the historical to the procedural, ready to play his part in the rhyme. The strategic shift was subtle but absolute. The voice understood that speaking within the chamber of echoes to the council was a closed loop. His words went in, were noted, and vanished. The system was designed to absorb and nullify communication directed at its center. Therefore, he would change the audience. He would not stop speaking to the council. That was his mandated role. But he would begin speaking, through the content and framing of his report, to a different listener entirely, to the people of the city, and to the future scribes who would record this moment. His report would be a public document, entered into the record, but crafted to be heard beyond the chamber's walls. He would use his granted voice not to petition the powerful, but to describe the powerful's failure to the powerless. This was the new layer of analysis, the systemic exploitation of the system's own publicity. The council loved the theater of governance very well. He would give them a drama they could not control. His report would not be a request. It would be a testimony. It would bear witness. By meticulously connecting the current contamination to past, documented warnings, he would shift the narrative. The story would no longer be, the Eastern Quarter has a water problem. The story would become, the council has a history of ignoring the water problems it was warned about. This reframing was the weapon. It attacked not the problem but the legitimacy of the problem solver. It used the system's own records to accuse it of systemic negligence. The tone would remain calm, factual, precise, but the subtext would be a thunderclap. Every citation of a past noted report would be a quiet accusation. Every reference to the civic charter would be a reminder of a duty unfulfilled. He would speak the truth so clearly, so backed by evidence, that to dismiss it would require the council to publicly dismiss its own archives, its own procedures, its own stated principles. They would be trapped by their own love of order and precedent. To silence him would be to admit the voice was never meant to be heard. To accept his report and do nothing would be to admit their power was decorative. To act on it would be to validate his method, to acknowledge that the voice, when armed with truth and memory, could indeed force a decision. This was fighting with his trade. His trade was not mere speech. It was forensic accounting of public trust. It was historical auditing. It was the construction of an argument so robust that it became a public fact in itself, a fact that would circulate in the taverns and markets, repeated by people who had never set foot in the chamber of echoes. The smell of the poisoned well would now have a companion, the sound of his report, a dry, relentless recitation of failure that would stick in the city's mind long after the smell was gone. This strategic shift moved the conflict from the personal, his frustration, to the societal, a question of public accountability. It integrated his private maps and ledgers into the official discourse, not as rebellion, but as superior scholarship. He was not breaking the rules. He was demonstrating a masterful understanding of them, an understanding so complete that it revealed the rules were not designed for justice, but for obfuscation, and in that revelation, whispered from the lectern to the scribes to the streets, lay the potential for the system's undoing. The reaction was not immediate anger, it was a colder, more calculated response. The day after the contaminated well was reported in the markets, a summons arrived at the Voices' apartment. It was not from the council chamber, but from the Office of Civic Harmony, a lesser bureau concerned with ceremonies and public morale. The official who met him was young, impeccably dressed, and smelled faintly of lavender water. The office was warm, paneled in light wood, a stark contrast to the stone of the main citadel. The official smiled. "A troubling matter in the eastern quarter," he began, his tone smooth. "The council is deeply concerned, of course. Such public distress is unfortunate. To demonstrate our commitment, we are creating a new forum, a special committee on quarter vitality. You will be its chairman. It will meet weekly. You may invite representatives from the merchant guilds, the tenant associations. You will have a dedicated scribe. Your findings will be presented directly to the council." The offer was a masterpiece of systemic defense. It was the escalation of the trap. They were offering more voice, a bigger title, a larger stage, more symbolism. It was an attempt to reabsorb his nascent challenge into a new, more elaborate, but equally powerless ritual. The special committee would become a talking shop, a place where grievances could be vented at greater length, with more paperwork. Creating the illusion of profound engagement while changing nothing, the societal integration here was clear. When a symbolic system is threatened, it does not fight with force, it fights with more symbolism, it offers promotion within the illusion. It makes the cage more comfortable, more ornate, and gives the prisoner a key to a door that leads to another, identical cell. The official leaned forward, his voice confidential. "This is a great honor. It shows the council values your unique understanding of the quarter's needs. It is a step toward real influence." The words were the scent of lavender masking the rot. The touch was the polished wood of the desk, smooth and deceptive. The sound was the reasonable, accommodating tone designed to disarm. This was the societal layer's immune response. The system had identified a potential source of friction, a voice who was beginning to use his platform not as a release valve, but as a spotlight. Its solution was to give him a brighter spotlight, pointed at a blank wall. To accept would be to be neutralized. To refuse would be to appear ungrateful, rebellious, to reject the very inclusion he had ostensibly sought. It was a checkmate in velvet. The voice listened, his face calm. He felt the old hooks in his mind, the psychological mechanisms stirring. The promise of influence, the satisfaction of a title, the hope that maybe this time the new forum would be different. He recognized the feeling. It was the same feeling he had after every session in the Chamber of Echoes, the placebo of participation. He let the feeling rise, and then he let it pass. He looked at the young official, at the clean hands that had never touched crumbling mortar or stained parchment. "Thank you for the council's consideration," he said, his voice as measured as ever. "I will, of course, serve in any capacity that benefits the Eastern Quarter. I would need to review the committee's charter, its mandate, and its budgetary authority before I can accept." His response was not refusal. It was a request for specifications. It was the language of the system, used to probe the emptiness of the offer. It was the first quiet parry in the trap he himself was setting. The conflict was now fully engaged. The system was revealing its true face, not as a wall, but as a quicksand, offering to pull him deeper in. and he was preparing to use its own substance, its love of procedure and documentation, to build a solid footing from which he might yet step out. The trap was set with the precision of a master craftsman, using the materials of his trade. The voice spent the next days not in refusal, but in meticulous preparation for the role he had been offered. He requested the charter for the Special Committee on Quarter Vitality. It arrived, a document of fine vellum, its language grand and vague. It spoke of fostering dialogue, of identifying concerns, of making recommendations. It mentioned no budget. It specified no authority to requisition materials or labor. It was, as he expected, a shell. He then drafted his acceptance, but appended a document of his own creation. He called it the Preliminary Framework for Action. It was a work of systemic jiu-jitsu. In it, he did not challenge the committee's purpose. He embraced it, and then defined its terms so rigorously that they became a weapon. The framework began by gratefully acknowledging the Council's creation of the committee. It then stated that to fulfill its mandate of addressing quarter vitality, the committee's first order of business must be to resolve the immediate public health crisis, the aquifer contamination. It argued that dialogue without the capacity to act on its conclusions was empty and contrary to the spirit of the Charter. Therefore, the framework proposed that the committee be granted, on a provisional and emergency basis, two specific powers. First, the power to audit and reallocate existing, unused infrastructure maintenance funds already allocated to the Eastern Quarter in the Citadel's ledgers. Second, the power to directly engage the city's master stonemasons and engineers, bypassing the usual procurement office, for an emergency assessment and repair. He did not invent these powers, he deduced them. The right to reallocate unused funds was implied in the Council's own fiscal ordinances. The right to engage experts in an emergency was a precedent set during a fire 50 years prior. He cited both chapter and verse. His document was not a demand, it was a logical extension of the committee's stated purpose, supported by the system's own laws and history. It was the dress woven from the system's own thread, but cut to a pattern that would force movement. If they accepted his framework, they would be granting real temporary power, breaking their own model of false inclusion. If they rejected it, they would be publicly admitting that the special committee was never meant to do anything but talk, exposing the hollow offer for what it was. The setup was complete. He would present this not as a rebellion, but as the responsible first step of a diligent chairman. He would present it in the Chamber of Echoes during his regular report, before the special committee even held its first meeting. He would use his granted voice to propose a modification of the grant itself. This was the twist. He was fighting with his trade, the trade of procedure, precedent, and document analysis. The feast that would poison was this framework, a dish made from the Council's own legal and historical pantry. To consume it by accepting his logic would give him a tool to fix the well. To spit it out by rejecting his logic would reveal their ill will to the entire city, whose scribes would record the rejection. The trap was baited with their own desire for legitimacy. They could not afford to look irresponsible in the face of a documented public health crisis. They could not afford to look tyrannical by rejecting a reasonable, legally grounded proposal from their own appointed chairman. Their greed for control, for maintaining the appearance of benevolent order, had backed them into a corner of their own design. The voice rolled his framework document with his regular report. The smell of ink was strong on the paper. The sound of the parchment rolling was a dry, final whisper. The touch was the slight resistance of the cord as he tied it. The stage was set, the actors were in place, the script was written, now the performance. The night before the session he did not sleep. He sat in his room, the candle long since burned out, the only light the faint glow from the city below his window. The smell of the quarter was still there, the faint, persistent odor of the tainted well carried on the night air. He did not review his documents, he knew them. Every citation, every precedent, every logical link was etched into his mind. Instead, he sat in the dark and let his hands rest on the cool wood of his desk. He felt the familiar grooves and stains under his fingertips. This was the quiet preparation of the spirit. The sound was the distant, occasional bark of a dog, the sigh of the old building settling. The touch was the smooth, worn wood, a testament to years of silent work. The smell was the lingering scent of tallow smoke and ink, the atmosphere of his private world. This was the relief, the grounding before the storm. It was not an escape from tension, but a descent into a deeper calm, the calm of the archer who has practiced the shot 10,000 times and now, on the eve of the contest, simply breathes. He thought not of victory, but of the act itself. The act of speaking truth to power was not a dramatic confrontation, it was a technical delivery. It was the final, careful placement of a stone in an arch he had been building for years. His personal skill, his bleeding fingers, were the countless hours of study. The broth that sustained him was the clarity of understanding he had cooked from raw data. This moment was the culmination of that quiet virtue. He was not going to fight, he was going to perform a flawless piece of his trade. He would stand at the lectern as he had 1,000 times before. He would feel the cold stone under his hands. He would hear the expectant silence. He would see the 9 figures in crimson, their faces masks of accustomed patience. And he would begin. His voice would not shake. It would be the same clear, measured instrument they knew, but the words would be different. They would be stones, each one carefully selected, fitted together into a wall of fact that they would have to climb over or break against. He felt no anger, only a profound focus. The helper, Elric, was down in the undercroft, perhaps asleep, perhaps listening to the drip of water that told its own story. The ghosts in the archive were silent. The people of the quarter were in their beds, breathing air that still carried the threat of sickness. He was the point where all these threads converged, the weaver at the loom. His personal layer was now fully integrated with the systemic, the historical, the societal. He was no longer just a man with a grievance. He was a function of the system's own failure, a living algorithm programmed by neglect, now executing a subroutine of accountability. As the first grey light began to touch the sky, he rose from his chair. His body was stiff, but his mind was clear. He dressed in his grey robe, feeling the rough wool against his skin. He gathered the rolled documents, their weight insignificant in his hand. He left his apartment, the door closing with a soft click behind him. He walked through the waking quarter, the smell of baking bread beginning to mix with the foul odor from the well. People were stirring. Some nodded to him, their expressions worried. He nodded back, a small, calm gesture. He did not speak. He walked towards the citadel, towards the chamber of echoes, to do the only thing he had ever been truly allowed to do, to speak. The chamber of echoes was full, word had spread. The public galleries, usually sparsely populated, were crowded with people from all quarters, their faces pale in the dim light. The air was thick, warmer than usual, carrying the smell of many bodies, of wool damp from the spring mist, of anticipation. The Council of 9 took their seats with a slower, more deliberate gravity. The senior councillor's face was a careful blank. The ritual began, the nod. The voice stepped forward. He placed his documents on the lectern. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the 9 men in crimson. He felt the cold stone under his palms. He began. His voice was the same clear, measured instrument. Honored councillors, this is my report on the state of the Eastern Quarter. He did not start with the well. He started with history. He cited the report from 103 years prior, the fever following water failure. He gave the archive reference. He cited the report from 50 years later, the cracks in the granary foundation. He gave the archive reference. He cited his own report from 3 years ago, the detailed description of the aqueduct's deteriorating condition. He reminded them of the notation. Noted by the council. He spoke not with accusation, but with the flat tone of an archivist reading a catalogue. Then he introduced the present. He described the contaminated well. He did not use emotional language. He described the color, the viscosity, the smell. He cited the testimony of the master stonemason, obtained through Elric, on the specific location of the breach near the burial grounds. He presented the sketch. He connected the physical evidence to the historical record. This was not a new problem, he said, his voice echoing softly in the high ceiling. It is the matured consequence of a documented and noted pattern of deferred maintenance. He paused. The silence was absolute. The scratching of the scribe's pens was the only sound. Then he introduced the framework. He explained the council's gracious offer of the special committee. He expressed his gratitude. And then he presented his preliminary framework for action as the necessary first step for that committee to have meaning. He read the 2 proposed provisional powers. He cited the fiscal ordinance that allowed reallocation of unused funds. He cited the emergency precedent of the Great Fire. His logic was a chain, each link a fact, a law, a precedent. He was not making a request, he was demonstrating a syllogism. If the council is committed to quarter vitality, and if the committee is its instrument, and if an immediate public health crisis exists, then the committee requires these tools to function. To deny the tools is to deny the premise. He finished. He did not ask for a response. He simply stopped speaking. He stood there, his hands on the lectern. The presentation of the trap was complete. The societal layer was fully engaged. The entire city, represented in the gallery, had heard it. The scribes had recorded it. The argument was now public property. It existed in the space between the council and the people, a bridge built from the council's own stones. They could not ignore it. They had to engage with it. The senior councillor did not nod. He stared at the voice, his mask of patience gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. The other councillors shifted in their seats. One leaned over and whispered urgently to his neighbor. The sound was a faint hiss in the vast quiet. The conflict was no longer hidden in subtext. It was on the floor of the chamber, in the dry, impeccable language of governance. The voice had used his granted voice to its absolute limit. He had spoken. And for the first time in the history of that chamber, the words did not vanish into the archive. They hung in the air, solid, demanding a decision. The trap was sprung. The council was in it. The collapse was not a loud crash. It was a slow, grinding halt. The senior councillor did not speak for a long moment. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then oppressive. The crowd in the gallery leaned forward. Finally, the councillor cleared his throat. A sound like gravel shifting. The voice of the eastern quarter, he began, his tone carefully modulated to convey gravitas, not anger. Your report is, as always, thorough. The council appreciates the depth of your historical research. However, the word hung in the air. However, the proposal to grant provisional powers to a committee, however well-intentioned, sets a dangerous precedent. It bypasses established channels of procurement and treasury oversight. It could lead to confusion, to misuse of funds. The safety and order of the city depend on these channels. We cannot, in good conscience, undermine them, even in an emergency. The argument was the system's last line of defense. It was an appeal to its own deepest value, procedural purity. It was the greed for control manifesting as a love of order. To grant the powers would be to admit that the established channels had failed. that the order was flawed. They would rather let the well fester than admit that this was the fall. They were destroying themselves through their own attachment to the form of power over its substance. The voice had anticipated this. He did not argue, he simply waited. Another counselor, a younger man with a sharp face, spoke up. "Perhaps a compromise," he said, his voice quick. "The committee can make its recommendations. The Office of Public Works can then expedite the review. We can promise a decision within, say, 30 days. It was another offer of process, of delay. It was the system trying to reassert the old rhythm, to turn the demand for action back into a promise of future consideration. But the trap had been sprung in public. The gallery murmured. The smell of the crowd's anxiety grew sharper. The voice finally spoke, his voice still calm. "Honored councillors, the emergency is not a future condition, it is present. The aquifer contaminates the water as we speak. The precedent of the Great Fire saw the master mason hired within 3 days under a similar provisional authority. The channels were restored after the emergency passed. The law already contains the flexibility you fear to exercise. I am not proposing to break the channels. I am proposing to use them as the law and history already allow." He was not fighting their argument. He was refining it, showing that their fear was based on a misreading of their own rules. He was a better technician of the system than they were. The senior counselor's face tightened. He saw the bind. To reject the proposal now required rejecting the voice's interpretation of the law and the historical precedent. It required a public declaration that the flexibility in the law was only for conveniences they chose, not for necessities they had ignored. It would make them look not principled, but callous and arbitrary. Their greed to maintain the appearance of flawless control was forcing them into a corner where the only way to keep control was to relinquish a tiny piece of it. The collapse was internal, a failure of their own logic. After another tense silence, the senior counselor spoke, his voice drained of its earlier force. "The council will consider the framework. A formal response will be issued." It was a retreat, not a victory, but a capitulation to process. They had not said yes, but they had not been able to say no. They had been forced to engage with the substance of the proposal on the record. The system's perfect, silent absorption of speech had been broken. The link between voice and consequence, severed for a century, had been forcibly reconnected, if only by a thread. The justice was not dramatic, it was administrative. The villain, the system itself, had been caught in its own contradiction. Its need to preserve its legitimacy forced it to validate the voice's superior command of its own rules. The fall was the sound of a gavel not falling, of a decision deferred but now inevitable. The air in the chamber felt different, charged. The old rhythm was broken. This specific collapse, the breaking of a single ritual in a single city, must be placed within the long arc of institutional change. History shows that hierarchies rarely fall to external conquest alone. More often they erode from within, worn down by the intelligent, patient work of those who are included in their forms, but excluded from their substance. The Roman Republic did not fall to barbarian kings in a day. It was hollowed out over centuries by client states that learned to manipulate Roman law, by provincial governors who used their offices to build private armies, by plebeians who slowly extracted rights through secession and legal precedent. The absolute monarchies of Europe did not vanish in a single revolution. They were constrained over generations by parliaments that learned to wield the power of the purse, by jurists who developed theories of constitutional law, by bureaucrats who implemented policies that slowly redistributed power. In each case, the agents of change were not outsiders with new ideologies. They were insiders who became better technicians of the existing system than the system's custodians. They used the master's tools, but with a finer understanding of the blueprint. The voice's victory, if it can be called that, was of this historical type. He did not overthrow the council. He did not inspire a mob to storm the citadel. He used the council's own archives, its own laws, its own procedures, to force a crack in its operational reality. This is the historical integration. His story is a microcosm of a macro pattern. The powerless win not by acquiring the power of the powerful, but by mastering the grammar of power so completely that they can write a sentence the powerful are forced to read. The collapse of false inclusion is therefore not an event, but a process. It begins with perception, the recognition that the granted voice is a tool that can be sharpened. It proceeds with study, the deep immersion in the system's rules and history. It culminates in a precise, public application of that knowledge at a moment of systemic vulnerability. Often a crisis the system itself has created through neglect. The historical layer provides the cold comfort of precedent. It says you are not alone, your struggle is not unique. The pattern has played out before and will again. The walls that seem permanent are often just the most recent iteration of a design flaw that has brought down similar structures in the past. The helper, Elric, represents the physical decay that is history's constant companion to such systems. The archives hold the written record of the flaw. The voice became the synthesizing agent who connected the physical to the historical to the procedural. His action, therefore, was not just personal or local. It was a participation in a long, slow, human tradition of institutional jitsu. The peace that may follow, the repaired aqueduct, the clean well, will not be a happily ever after. It will be a temporary restoration of function, a proof that the circuit between voice and action can be repaired. But the system, the hierarchy, will likely remain. The council will still sit in crimson, the voices will still report. The change is subtler. It is the introduction of a memory, a precedent, a demonstrated possibility that the next time the system fails so egregiously, the response may not be a quiet note in the archive, but another calibrated, legally grounded demand. This is how wisdom restores peace. Not by destroying the castle, but by teaching some of its inhabitants how to read the architectural plans and point out the load-bearing walls that are cracking. The result was not a revolution, but a recalibration. The council's formal response arrived 3 days later. It was a document of masterful bureaucratic ambiguity, but its core concession was clear. The Special Committee on Quarter Vitality was hereby authorized to oversee the emergency repair of the Eastern Aqueduct. It was granted provisional access to a specified fund, already allocated but unspent, for materials. It was permitted to engage the city's master mason for an assessment, with any further contracts subject to expedited review. The powers were limited, time-bound and wrapped in layers of reporting requirements, but they were real. The system had not been destroyed. Its false inclusion had been temporarily and partially replaced by a fragile but authentic linkage between voice and agency. The voice received the document in his apartment. He read it by the light of his window. The words were dry, legalistic. But they meant that stones would be moved, mortar mixed, water would flow clean again. He felt no exultation. He felt a profound, quiet fatigue, and beneath it, a sharp, clear understanding. This was the systemic analysis of the outcome. The system's deepest flaw was its belief that it could indefinitely decouple speech from action. The crisis and his precise, public argument had forced a temporary recoupling. The wisdom was in understanding that this recoupling was the system's own latent potential, buried in its laws and precedents, waiting to be activated by someone who understood the machinery better than its operators. Peace was restored not by the overthrow of the powerful, but by the demonstration that their power was not absolute, that it was constrained by the very rules and records they had created to legitimize it. The repaired aqueduct would be a monument to that understanding, not to his personal triumph. The change was systemic, not personal. The council still held power, the voices would still report. But the archive now contained a new precedent, a document showing that a voice, armed with evidence and procedure, could force a specific material outcome. This precedent would seep into the institutional memory. Future councils might be more cautious. Future voices might study the archives more closely. The circuit, while fragile, had been proven to exist. The result is therefore not an ending, but a shift in the system's operating parameters. The cruelty of pure false inclusion had been exposed and, in this one instance, partially remedied. The cost of maintaining the illusion had been raised. The system would continue, but it would now carry within it the memory of its own vulnerability to a certain kind of meticulously prepared truth. This is the practical survival manual. It does not promise escape from the hierarchy. It offers a method for introducing friction, for creating moments of accountability, for using the system's own weight against its inertia. It teaches that the victory of the powerless is often measured in inches, in repaired aqueducts, in established precedents, in the slow, patient education of the powerful in the limits of their own design. The voice rolled the council's response and placed it in the hollow behind the brick with his map and his ledgers. His archive was complete. The story was now part of the record, both the official one in the citadel and the private one in his wall. He sat at his desk. The room was silent. The smell of ink and old paper was familiar. The work was done, for now. The work on the aqueduct began the following week. The sound in the eastern quarter was no longer the silence of neglect, but the distant, rhythmic tap of masons' hammers, the scrape of stone on stone. The murmur of men at labor, the smell of the tainted well gradually faded, replaced by the clean, mineral scent of freshly turned earth and wet mortar. The voice did not oversee the work. That was for the master mason and the committee's appointed clerk. He attended the first meeting of the Special Committee on Quarter Vitality. It was held in a small, sunlit room in the Citadel's administrative wing. The air smelled of beeswax and new parchment. Representatives from the merchant guilds and tenant associations sat around a polished table. They spoke of logistics, of work schedules, of temporary water supplies. Their voices were practical, focused. He listened. He spoke only to clarify a point of procedure. When the meeting ended, he walked back through the citadel's corridors, the sound of his footsteps absorbed by the thick rugs. He returned to his apartment as evening fell. He did not light a candle. The room was dark, the only light the deep blue of twilight at the window. He sat at his desk. His hands rested on the smooth, scarred wood. The ledgers were closed. The map was rolled away. The hollow in the wall was sealed. The room was silent. The only smell was the faint, lingering scent of the ink pot and the cool night air coming through the window. He was not the voice in this moment. He was not the chairman. He was a man in a quiet room, the work done. The peace was not in celebration. It was in the absence of a particular kind of tension, the tension of a circuit held open against its nature. The circuit was now closed for a time. Water would flow. The evidence was in the sound of the hammers, in the fading odor, in the dry language of the authorization document in the archive. He sat for a long time in the gathering dark. Then he rose and went to bed. The next morning he would put on his grey robe. He would walk to the chamber of echoes. He would stand at the lectern. He would wait for the nod, and he would speak.